Welcome to Chromaticus. Today we're going to talk about the different types of diminished chords, their functions, and the chord scales that go with them. There are three types of diminished chords, all with different functions and different options for chord scales. We have ascending diminished chords, descending diminished chords, and the auxiliary diminished chords. Before we get into each individual diminished chord, its point of resolution, and the appropriate chord scale, let's first look at the origins of the diminished chord. Let's take the key of C harmonic minor. If you stack in thirds, which is how you build chords in tertiary harmony, you get G, B, D, and F, your G dominant chord. Well, if you add one more third to that, the A flat, you now have G7 flat 9. If you then get rid of the root, the G, then the next interval, the third, or B, becomes the new root of a diminished seventh chord built on the seventh degree of C harmonic minor and now resolves up a half step instead of down a fifth. That B diminished 7 moving up a half step to C minor falls into our first category of ascending diminished chords, which are diatonic and are substitutes for primary or secondary dominants. They contain the same tritone as the dominant chord and therefore have the same dominant cadential function. These are the sharp 1 diminished 7, sharp 2 diminished 7, sharp 4 diminished 7, and the sharp 5 diminished 7. They can precede any diatonic chord except the 7 minor 7 flat 5 because of how unstable it is. The first ascending diminished chord that we're going to look at is the passing chord between the 1 chord and the 2 chord, and that is the sharp 1 diminished 7. This has the same secondary dominant function as the 5 of the 2 chord, in the same way as the last example where B diminished 7 took the place of the G7 flat 9 chord. The sharp 1 diminished 7 takes the place of the 5 of the 2 chord. So you have A7 flat 9, the 5 of D minor 7, and you just get rid of the root, and then the third, C sharp, becomes the new root of the diminished chord, which now resolves up a half step to D minor 7 or the 2 chord. If you look at the passing chord between the 2 chord and the 3 chord, the same principles apply. If you take the dominant 7 flat 9 of the 3 chord and remove the root, what you're left with is sharp 2 diminished 7 that resolves up a half step to the 3 chord and has that same secondary dominant function. Next, we have the sharp 4 diminished 7. It's actually quite rare for this to act as a substitute for the 5 of 5 as the other chords did. The few cases in the repertoire where you do see this, it's typically on a weak metric stress like this, and 5 of 5 is always on a strong metric stress, so it just doesn't have that same kind of dominant cadential feeling that the 5 of 5 does. So while it is pretty rare to see this move up a half step to the G7, you can do it. It is an interesting sound, but it's much more common in the repertoire to see it move to an alternate resolution, which I'm going to cover at the very end because there's alternate resolutions for quite a few of these chords. So just hold on to that for a second. Next, we have the passing chord between the 5 chord and the 6 chord, and this is the sharp 5 diminished 7, and this is the substitute for the 5 of the 6 chord. The next category is descending diminished chords, sometimes called chromatic approach chords. These are non-diatonic and non-dominant, and they resolve to diatonic chords through chromatic resolution and voice leading. They are the flat 3 diminished 7 and the flat 6 diminished 7. The first chord is flat 3 diminished 7. Now I have this as a passing chord between the 3 chord and the 2 chord here, but it's pretty common to see the descending diminished chords unprepared. In other words, instead of passing between 3 and 2, this chord would be something else, and then it would just sort of be unprepared, descending chromatically to the 2 chord. But either way it works. And the reason that it works is because of chromatic voice leading and because of sharing common tones. The C, which is really D double flat, and the A, which is really B double flat, are both common tones in the D minor 7, and then the E flat moves down a half step to D, and the G flat moves down a half step to the F. So you have 2 common tones, and then the other 2 tones moving down by a half step chromatically. This is a very smooth resolution here. Next, we have the flat 6 diminished 7, and this resolves in the same way. It shares 2 common tones, and then the other 2 tones move down by half step. This can resolve to G minor 7 as a related 2 minor 7 of the 5 of 4, or it could also resolve to the G7 like it does down here. When resolving to the G7, it shares 3 common tones instead of 2, so only 1 note actually moves. So it's honestly kind of an odd sound, and it's more common to see it resolve to a G minor 7 as that related 2 chord. But this is of course always up to the composer and the sound that they're going for. Just a quick side note, if you have a chord moving chromatically between 2 other chords, as in 1 major 7, sharp 1, and then 2, this is called a passing chord. In this case, it would be a passing diminished chord. And if they're unprepared, as the example over here, they're called approach chords. Each of these types of chords has a kind of a unique sound to it, so it's important as a composer that you play around with the 2 different types and become familiar with their sounds so you know in a specific given situation what sound you're looking for and what fits best in a given context. The third type is auxiliary diminished chords, which are really just an embellishment of a chord that shares a diatonic root with the chord of resolution and are non-dominant diminished chords. These are 1 diminished 7 and 5 diminished 7. First, let's look at the 1 diminished 7 chord. In the first example up here, the C diminished 7 acts as an embellishment of the 1 chord. This is quite useful in a section of a song, such as the ending, where there might be up to 4 bars of just a 1 chord. This embellishment gives just a touch of color and movement to an otherwise static environment. And in the second example, it's used as a way to delay the resolution of the 5 chord. And next we have the 5 diminished 7, which is pretty straightforward here. It's an embellishment of the 5 chord. Now let's talk about chord scales and the different options that we have for each type of diminished chord. If you remember back to the beginning of the lesson when we looked at the G7 flat 9 chord, which came from the 5th degree of C harmonic minor, and then we simply removed that root, and then the third, the B, became the root of the new B diminished 7th chord, which then resolves up a half step instead of down a fifth. Well, in order to find out the scale, we would extract it exactly the same way. The diatonic chord scale for that G7 flat 9 chord from C harmonic minor is G mixolydian flat 9 flat 13, also known as Phrygian dominant. Anytime you have a dominant scale that has a flat 9 in it, you can always add its complement, the sharp 9. This gives us an 8-note scale, G mixolydian flat 9 sharp 9 flat 13. If we then want this chord scale to represent that B diminished 7th chord, we simply respell the chord scale starting from the 3rd degree, which in this case is B. This gives us a version of a B diatonic diminished scale, which you can now use on your B diminished 7th chord that resolves up a half step to C. This process works for the sharp 1, the sharp 2, and the sharp 5 ascending diminished chords. You just have to make sure that you're taking the chord scale from the key of the moment. In other words, if you have the sharp 1 chord moving to the 2 minor 7th chord, in this case D minor, the key of the moment would be D minor. So the original chord scale of that 5 of the 2 chord would be the A mixolydian flat 9 sharp 9 flat 13, and you'd spell it from the 3rd degree, the C sharp, and you would get that C sharp diatonic diminished scale moving up a half step to that D minor chord. The exception for the ascending diminished chords is that sharp 4 diminished 7. This is the weirdo of the group, so let's take a closer look at this one. The sharp 4 diminished 7 moving to a 5 chord is pretty rare, but let's take a look at our chord scale options just in case you decide to use this sound in your own music. The first iteration here is on a strong metric stress, which is taking the place of the 5 of the 5 chord, which would be D7. So the chord scale would come from the same scale used for the D7, which would be D mixolydian. However, the diminished chord has an E flat in it, not an E natural, so you would have to use an altered form of D mixolydian, which would be D mixolydian flat 9. And remember, anytime you see a flat 9 in a dominant chord scale, you can add in its complement, the sharp 9. This gives us a new scale of D mixolydian flat 9 sharp 9, which we then respell from the F sharp, and we get an F sharp diatonic diminished scale. In the second iteration over here, the F sharp diminished 7 is a passing chord and falls on a weak metric stress, which means it does not give the impression of the 5 of 5. In this case, it tends to sound a little more like an inversion of the sharp 2 diminished 7, which means that we can use the same chord scale we used for sharp 2 diminished 7, which was taking the place of 5 of the 3 chord, which was B mixolydian flat 9 sharp 9 flat 13, which we would then respell from the 5th degree or F sharp, and we would get the second version of an F sharp diatonic diminished scale. The sharp 4 diminished 7 is pretty obscure, and when it does appear in the repertoire, it's more common to see it resolve to an alternate resolution, which I'm going to cover at the end of the lesson. Now let's look at the scales for the descending diminished chords, and you'll see we have a couple of different options. For example, if we take a flat 3 diminished 7th chord in the key of C, the chord tones are as follows. The root E flat, G flat, B double flat, which we're just going to call A because it's a little bit easier to read, and D double flat, which we're going to call C because again, it's a little bit easier to read. It's just an enharmonic spelling of the same tones though. If we then add in the other scale tones from the home key of C, we get this scale, an E flat diatonic diminished scale. So we have the chord tones E flat, G flat, A, C, and then the tones that we filled in came from C major. We have E natural, G natural, B natural, and D natural. But we have another option for this scale. Notice that there's a tone we didn't use, the F natural, the 4th degree of C major. So if you simply swap out this 2nd degree, the E natural, for F, we now have a natural 9 instead of a flat 9 in our scale. Now there's nothing wrong with this diminished scale, it's just that this degree here, the flat 9, is a harmonic avoid note. So you can't use it harmonically, and even melodically you don't really want to land on it because it's a pretty aggressive, very dissonant sound. However, with this scale here, the F natural you can use harmonically, and you can also use it melodically, and you can even land on it and hold it for a while and it will sound great. So for the flat 3 diminished 7, you have these two chord scale options, which are both just versions of diatonic diminished scales. Using the same process for the flat 6 diminished 7th chord, in this case A flat diminished 7, moving to G minor or sometimes G dominant 7, we get one version of an A flat diatonic diminished scale. This scale is pretty ugly to look at. We have a C flat, which we'll call B, we have an E double flat, an F flat, a G double flat, so it can be a little bit easier to think about even though it's not technically correct if you think of it as B, D, E, and F instead of those double flats. We'll now use the same process for the auxiliary 1 diminished 7th chord. We'll take the chord tones of C, E flat, G flat, and B double flat, which we'll call A. We'll add in the chord tones from C major, which are D, the E natural, the G natural, and the B natural. And we get this version of C diatonic diminished. But notice again, we use this E natural, but we didn't use the F. So we have an optional chord scale if we swap out the E natural for F natural, which gives us this version of C diatonic diminished. Now in this case, instead of the 9th degrees being different, it's the 4th degree, sometimes called the 11th. So here we have a flat 11, which is actually just the same as the major 3rd. So you get a clash with the minor 3rd harmonically. And if we swap that out for the F, we have a natural 11th or 4th degree, which is now available as a harmonic tension, as well as a very pleasing melodic tone. So either scale works, and it's up to the composer or the player to choose which scale they want, what kind of sound they're looking for in the moment. And with the 5 diminished 7, using the same process of combining the chord tones with the scale tones from the home key, we get this version of G diatonic diminished. For our auxiliary and descending chord scales, we have another option, the aggressive and dark sounding symmetric diminished scale. This is considered sonically to be fairly aggressive, caustic, and sort of outside, and it's recommended to use quite sparingly and only for a special effect. Another school of thought, to which I personally agree, is because it's a non-functional scale, it can be used for diminished chords with non-dominant function that resolve chromatically. So this is a great scale for descending and auxiliary diminished chords. That's not to say that you can't use the symmetric diminished scale every time you see a diminished chord. You can if you want to, but you have to want that sound in the moment. I've shown you all these different scale options so you can make an artistic choice within a given context of what sound you're looking for, rather than just using one scale all the time as a crutch. Before we finish up today, I want to show you a few alternate resolutions for some of these chords. Pay careful attention to the bass note in these alternate resolutions, as it's always the same note as the root of the original chord of resolution. This consistent bass motion in the alternate resolution helps the ear to accept the alternate chord. So our first example, the C sharp diminished 7 here, originally resolved to a 2 minor 7th chord, which was D minor 7. The alternate resolution is to G7, but it's over D. So the bass motion of C sharp to D is exactly the same whether it goes to that 2 minor 7th chord, the D minor 7, or whether it goes to this alternate resolution, the 5 chord, because the G7 is in second inversion, so D is still in the bass. The sharp 2 diminished 7, which originally resolved to a 3 minor 7, can resolve to the 1 chord in first inversion. So again, D sharp to E, that bass motion is exactly the same whether it goes to an E minor chord or a 1 major 6 chord in first inversion. The sharp 4 diminished 7 is probably the most important on this list because the original resolution to that dominant 5 chord is very rare, and when you usually do see it, it's on a weak beat and therefore it doesn't give that normal aural impression of a 5 of 5 chord. It's much more common to see this alternate resolution here to a 1 major 6 chord in second inversion. And again, the F sharp to G bass motion stays the same regardless. The sharp 5 diminished 7, which normally resolves to a minor 6 chord, can resolve instead to a dominant 6 chord, acting as the 5 of the 2 chord. Flat 3 diminished 7, which normally resolves to the 2 minor 7, can resolve to the 2 chords related 5 chord in second inversion, in this case the G7 over D. And flat 6 diminished 7, which normally resolves to the dominant 5 chord, can resolve instead to the 1 chord in second inversion, or in this case C6 over G. And notice again the bass motion A flat to G stays the same. Now let's take a quick listen to each of these alternate resolutions. Now you should have a much firmer grasp of diminished chords and the different scales that you can use, and hopefully your brain didn't melt out of your ears like mine did the first time I started looking at diminished chords. That's going to do it for us today. Keep studying, keep practicing, keep growing. See you next time.